Andy and Zach by, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I was going to say that I know Andy and Zach by name because I think I joined Berkeley as a grad student just as you guys had left. And Zach in particular, I remember seeing your notebooks on the shelves on the wall. My mentor back then was Dan Fox, and I think you probably know him quite well. So anyway, I went to grad school at Berkeley in chemistry, 2001 to 2006. So I was a joint student with two professors, Ken Raymond and Bob Bergman. So worked there for quite a bit. Prior to that, I was at Cornell on the East Coast, also studying chemistry. And then I, taking another step back, I grew up in the Midwest in North Dakota. So kind of hopping around the country there. So in Bob's group, did a lot of, I guess, physical, organic, mechanistic chemistry, learning how to think about chemical systems in that manner. Nothing particularly practical, I would say, and maybe, I don't know if Zach would agree with that or not. So after that, I ended up doing a 2-year postdoc at UC Irvine, looking at polymer catalysis and trying to get a taste of materials chemistry and so forth, something that I thought would be a little bit more practical. Ended up trying to go out for industry jobs at that point, really focusing my search on the traditional chemical industry companies like your DuPonts, your Dows, even Clorox, I think out here in the Bay Area. And I remember going to an ACS meeting at the time, and someone from Merck reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you mind having coffee?" Sure. So I had coffee with her, and she explained that they were forming a new group at that point, kind of a pre-formulation drug delivery type group at Merck. So really focused around drug discovery. And at that point, I had zero information or idea of what the pharmaceutical industry was really like. My interpretation was that you needed to be a total synthesis or really strong in organic synthesis, your med chem or process chemistry type background. And I had no idea that in the pharma industry that there are so many different specialized groups, all requiring very different aspects of chemistry to join them. And they're really looking for those people with that type of diverse background. Anyway, I interviewed with her. She ended up making an offer, ended up joining the company in 2007, ended up staying there for about 9 years or so. And then eventually in 2016, ended up coming back here to the Bay Area where I'm currently at Genentech, where I'm leading a kind of a drug delivery type group over here. So basically my path is starting from zero and then really learning on the job, learning on the way. And that's where I got to right now. So that's the very super quick whirlwind story.
Thank you, Dennis. Andrew.
Yeah, so Dennis, that was great. I think you definitely hit on some of the kind of the interesting elements of industry that you learn once you get there. So I came from California, went to school in Wisconsin, and then went back to Berkeley for graduate school. So I worked with John Ellman, who obviously has since left. We still give him a lot of crap for that, but he's actually been out for, I don't know, 10 years now. But so at the time when I first joined, John was just sort of getting up for tenure. But I'm sure you all know, at least just some familiarity with some of John's older work. We were doing sort of a mix of methodology and some kind of this polymer-based synthesis, although that was kind of winding down by the time I got there. Now, what was really fascinating about that time, and my good buddy Zach over here would probably say the same thing, is that in the mid 90s, of course, there was this huge wave of money that was sloshing around for .coms and things like that. And I still remember like half of my undergraduate classes disappearing when I was teaching, just to join various startups. And a couple of them, I remember one went to what was starting up as Yahoo. Most of them went to places that obviously fizzled out, and then you'd see them kind of wandering around a couple of years later. But it was really an interesting time. And what was also fascinating was that the human genome race was on. And when I was graduating, which is 2001, like a lot of people, I was interested in pursuing an academic career, and I had talked to my boss about a couple of postdocs. But the human genome was so exciting at the time. So it sort of promised to usher in this new wave of of biology, chemistry, and most importantly, medicine. And that really captured a lot of people's imagination. We didn't know at the time, of course, that it would actually take well over a decade, in fact, almost 2 decades, to really start to take advantage of it. But it was such an exciting time. And then all of a sudden, multiple companies started to hire. And so you could actually compete for a lot of jobs without a postdoc. So that's what I did. So I interviewed around. Most of the people that were interviewing had postdocs. And so, I still remember I went to one company and this guy showed me he like picked up a piece of paper and it was a list of 20 names. And he's like, you know what this is? And I said, no. He goes, these are the people you're competing with and they all have a postdoc, but you and this guy. He's like, so why should we hire you? I'm like, I don't know. I don't really particularly like this interview as it's going anyway. So maybe you shouldn't. I didn't say that, but it's really, I think it just captured kind of the moment in time where clearly everybody was so excited about what they thought this human genome solution could do. So I joined, me and a couple of other people from Cal, and of course, a bunch of other universities went to pharma, where there's just this blossoming of hiring and promise. Now, I think Dennis captured it really well. I did not, well, let me just implicate myself. I didn't really know what to look for in kind of a pharma other than I had friends at Merck and 2 at Pfizer and that stuff. So I wound up going to Abbott, which I remember Dave McMillan, who I think was still at Cal at the time, told me was a mistake. But the reason why I went there is because I remember interviewing and all the big pharma seemed very similar. It seemed very, very exciting, very similar. For whatever reason, I had this impression of Abbott when I visited that they were just starting to grow. So it was a pharma, but it was sort of a growing pharma and one that was sort of embracing all these new technologies, or at least that's the way it came across. So long story short, I went to Abbott, then in metabolic disease research. I was a medicinal chemist. Again, I'll borrow some of Dennis's great lines. Did not really know what a medicinal chemist does. But what you find out right away is it's multidisciplinary, and it's just incredibly intense if you want to learn. So there's just never an end to what you can learn. So I went from a sort of an untenured professor to, I don't know if John Ellman is ever acts tenured. So that I was coming from that environment going to pharma. So I worked like a grad student. I didn't have any kids or anything at the time. And it's in a lot of ways, I think a big company, for better or worse, is kind of like a big university. So if you're really interested in learning, you can basically do almost whatever you want if you're willing to just work really, really hard. So I've really, really enjoyed it. There are definitely days where I'm about to hand in my letter of resignation and all that good stuff. But I think what you find is if you're really excited about what you're doing and you want to constantly learn. And again, I'll steal a line from Dennis. You can actually do a lot of different things. And so I'll end there. But my group now, there's nothing special about it other than I'm trained as a chemist. My group is all biologists now. So I work with a lot of chemists, but I actually don't have a single chemist in my group anymore. I spend most of my time on genomics, clinical research, and really tracking patients sort of longitudinally, looking at biomarkers, and really trying to intersect biochemical pathways, and then working with chemists to try to come up with drugs. So that's one of many examples of folks that have just gone into various different directions. So it's been very, very exciting.
Thank you, Andrew. Zach, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about your career path?
Sure. So like Andrew and Dennis, I'm not going to be able to add very much to what Andy and Dennis mentioned, but I grew up in the Bay Area. Went to Stanford and then went to Cal for graduate school. I was a graduate student with Richard Anderson and Bob Bergman. And I think, my interests were always in common disease and actually genetics. I remember being an undergraduate and only learning about the genetics of lactose intolerance and hemophilia, actually, and sickle cell disease. I think those are the 3 diseases that we learned about. And as Andy mentioned, things have progressed quite a bit. And fundamentally, I joined the Bergman lab because I was interested in understanding how to make molecules. That wasn't what I focused on, but I realized very quickly at the time that Bob, who was my mentor, had moved around quite a bit actually in his career. And he operated from a very strong strength of understanding the mechanisms of organic reactions, and then was able to apply that to all sorts of different problems. So fundamentally, I realized pretty early on in my graduate career that I wasn't working in a sub-discipline of chemistry that I wanted to continue on, but I realized that if I focused on understanding reaction kinetics, that was potentially something that I could apply throughout my career, and ultimately that's what happened. So I wasn't as well prepared as Andy. So I did a postdoc at Harvard with Dave Evans, and there, became more resilient, met a lot of people, again, that were better at what I was trying to do than I was. And at that time, Cambridge was just emerging as a center, actually, of the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry. And my wife, who I met at Berkeley and worked for Clayton Hethcock, had a job at a burgeoning biotechnology company called Millennium Pharmaceuticals that actually had collaborations with Abbott, as AbbVie was known at the time. And so there I realized that, the demographics, the changing demographics, the population was aging, that healthcare would become an increasing part of the economy, and that there was really the opportunity to make my long-term interest in genetics manifest in something that I could actually contribute to. So I interviewed around. Most people weren't interested really in somebody with my background, but I was fortunate enough to find a head of a medicinal chemistry group at a major pharmaceutical company, Roche, that had also trained with my postdoctoral advisor. And he was willing to take a chance on me. And that was attractive in part because they were focusing on viral diseases. And I, having grown up in the Bay Area at the height of the HIV epidemic, that was, of course, something that I wanted to contribute to. And there was also actually the intersection with my interest in genetics through the identification of a receptor, CCR5, that when mutated in certain people makes them resistant to HIV infection. So all these things kind of came together. I relocated to the Bay Area, worked at Roche, ended up spending some time at Genentech and then at Novartis, all major pharmaceutical companies in the Bay Area, before transitioning into the biotech industry. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to have maximal control over the work that I was doing. And I thought that might be easier in a smaller company. And that's been very exciting. I've worked now at three different biotech companies. The industry has really changed. So there has been a lot more funding for interesting drug discovery in smaller companies, although in no way am I trying to contradict what Andy is saying about large pharmaceutical companies being a very interesting place to do work. So I was, what do they say? The term is like positions of increasing responsibility as you get older. Those things tend to happen. And I was, head of therapeutic discovery, then ultimately chief scientific officer, and most recently was able to found my own company here, Interline Therapeutics. And I spend a little bit of time doing chemistry, I guess is the last thing that I'll say, but mostly I focus on discovery technologies and new biologies in cancer and inflammatory diseases. So that's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Zach. And thank you all for answering that first question. Okay, so I did do a little survey before this event. So most people that signed up did get the survey. So I got a lot of the same questions. So I'm going to start with there. Again, I want to remind the attendees, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat or unmute yourselves and ask them to our panelists. So the question I got most often was, what are some essential skills that you feel are required for your particular roles? And then also, how has your degree prepared you for your current role? So we could start with Andrew.
Yeah, so I should say one thing. I'm going to contradict something that Zach said. We actually tried to hire him at 2 different sites at Abbott, and he basically pushed us off at both times. So yeah, but Zach had plenty of offers. Anyway, so yeah, that's a great question. And a couple of things come to mind. What I didn't appreciate when I first made the switch from, again, John Elman's lab at Berkeley to, this medicinal chemistry lab was, there wasn't I guess, a priority on behavior. I don't know how else to say it in graduate school. I love graduate school and I love the debate. I still sometimes miss the kind of intensity of just how you're sort of, most grad students are sort of truth seeking in a way. And it's the way I always thought about graduate school. And I think our group was like this, and a lot of other groups were, is you had, let's say, two scientists, and then you had the scientific subject matter, and there wasn't much interaction out. You could debate something even passionately, and it never seemed to kind of get into, it didn't raise any hackles, or, I think people were just used to it. Not to say, professors obviously can maybe take that a couple of steps too far sometime, but it was just such an invigorating environment. When you get, or at least when I got to industry, I didn't appreciate that's not necessarily the kind of behavior that translates in every environment. Because, the truth is, you have people that have been out of grad school for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, who may not be, they're just not used to that level of sort of intensity. This is where either doing a postdoc or just being more mature as a person coming out of grad school can help. But we see this all the time. We have professors actually that we hire that come in, and oftentimes they'll go through a little bit of an adjustment period too. So I think it's one of those elements where sort of having your ears open and just being ready to adapt, and maybe just trying to slow down a little bit and just really listen. Which everybody goes through a little bit of an adjustment period, but that was a big lesson. Now the other thing I think that certainly comes across, and I'm sure the other two would jump on this as well, is you work with so many different types of people to get anything done. And so it's interesting, you sort of go from an individual program to something where you're part of a large team, and you might, let's say, make a particular molecule that's advanced, or make a change in a synthetic route if you're in process chemistry. But without all of the people around you, any one thing you do won't go that particularly far. You sort of have to work as a team. And so embracing that as early as possible is very, very helpful, because then over time, whether you're at a, depending on, or I guess regardless of what kind of group you're in, you'll find that people will come to sort of trust your judgment. You'll hopefully trust theirs, and then they'll come to you, and you can sort of build up a network of scientists that you can go to for help. So those are two things that come to mind right away.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And Zachary.
Sure. I just want to start by reinforcing what Andy says. I think fundamentally more of what I do on a day-to-day basis relates to the principles of organizational psychology than it does to the kind of science that I was trained in. And I personally find that fascinating. And I actually think it's we're all lucky in some ways to be born where we are, and at the time that in this era, especially if we're interested in science. But being born in a diverse place like Northern California at a time where there were a lot of really very vigorous debates about identity, interaction, social psychology, and social organization had a huge impact on my life and how I think about people. And I've always been very interested in other people's backgrounds and the diversity that Andy mentioned. So I think that's a really important part of the job, and an exciting part of the job, hopefully to all of you. The second part of the question, sorry, can you repeat the question just really quickly to make sure that I'm on track here?
Sure. How has your degree from Cal prepared you for your current role? And then can you provide an essential skill you feel is required?
Right. Sorry. So I just want to make sure. So the other thing about, I worked for two professors. I got to know Andy very well because down in the Elman group, we had an incredibly diverse department. And I think the other critical aspect of, or the other critical skill set that I learned was to be as interested in what other people were doing as what I was doing. And it didn't mean that I wasn't working hard all the time, or I wasn't passionate about advancing my own research, but innovation fundamentally comes at the interface. And, if you're learning about what 20 other people are doing while you're doing your own work, you're obviously over the course of a, 30-year career like my own, going to learn a lot more than you would otherwise. So I think that understanding those two fundamental principles, again, that like you're most likely to innovate when you're working with people that have a different background than you do. And as a consequence, you should try to engage them, understand them, and interact with them as much as possible. It would be my advice, and that's something that I learned at Berkeley.
Great. Same kind of a common theme, the listening, adapting, the diversity. So thank you. And Dennis.
I think Andy and Zach stole my answer, so I'm not sure how much I can add. I was going to say really two skills, so one social and one more technical. And particularly when Andy mentioned, I wanted to reiterate that many of our peers, I think, had to make that decision of whether to go into academia and maybe become a professor at another school or go into industry. And I think one of the differences in terms of behavior is that academia, or being a research professor, is a very individual focused role. You're doing your own research and you can really drill down in depth into your research, right? And I think Bob, for example, has studied the exact same reaction for 20 years now, or maybe it's 30 years now. And then that's great, right? So he knows every little nuance of that particular reaction. That is not really how industry works. Right? So industry is so complex, and in particular, the pharmaceutical and the act of discovering medicines is so complex. You need help from biologists, molecular biology, structural biology, medicinal chemistry, drug metabolism, everything, all these different groups have to come together and contribute to a project. That the social skill is you have to, like Andy said, actively listen. You have to be able to work with people. You can't just put your head down in your fume hood and do your own thing. You have to be able to communicate, talk to others. It is a place where I learn something new every day, but it also doesn't mean that I'm trying to take over other people's roles. I have to trust what they do, and you have to learn how to do that to some extent. Kind of related to that, I would say, in terms of practical skills, knowing how to communicate, knowing how to present, have good presentation skills will be important and will help you for the rest of your career. That's the social part. The technical part, exactly what Zach said. I think we both worked for Bob. And I think even though Bob studied the same reaction for 20 years, I think that's actually a great venue for training grad students. So you really learned how to study molecules and really understand how they behave. And if you can do that and think like that, you can apply those skills to almost any system, whether it's a inorganic catalyst, whether it's a polymer, or whether it's a drug or a drug dosage form, right? That skill of being able to think about scientific problems and reduce them into components that you can really easily analyze has allowed me to adapt, learn new things, or pick up new things relatively quickly. Like I said, I knew nothing about the pharmaceutical industry when I first started. I know a little bit more now. So hopefully that's helpful. I forgot, I am wearing my Genentech t-shirt and my Cal hat, so representing there.
I do want to add on to what you said, Dennis, about presentation skills. It's hard to go back in time, but I remember being very nervous, during my first few group meetings, and I didn't have a good sense of how to structure a presentation, how to frame the problem statement, the constraints, the proposed solutions, the recommendation. And it's still something that, I work on all the time. And it's I think an important part of everybody who works in science. I mean, my fundamental job now is to raise tens of millions of dollars to keep my company going using short PowerPoint slide decks. And, I'm constantly trying to improve my ability to communicate on scientific topics.
Great, thank you. And as a follow-up, Zachary, so it's just practice with the presentation, huh? Over the years, just practice.
I think, you have to, in science, I mean, one of the beautiful things about it is that everybody fails and everybody realizes at some point that somebody else is better than them at solving a particular problem. So you have to really be committed to this idea of continuous improvement. And I find the ability to, continue on when it's not easy. So for me, giving presentations is a venue of continuous improvement. And, we got a lot of training through group meetings and qualifying, I think they were called qualifying presentations, and other presentations that you had to give at the time. And those are really, really important. Just to give you an idea of how old we were, we used to give those presentations, by the way, by slide carousel. So it was a major skill to prepare. I never mastered the skill, but there were people in my research group that could prepare slides.
I forgot
We use
about that.
transparencies, right?
Once you had made the slides, there are no more revisions. So that simplified that part of the process.
That's right. Okay, thank you. All right, so you all probably already touched a little bit about this, but can you talk to us a little bit about internships, when you were undergrads? What helped you, prepare for your roles now too? Any internships that you had that might you look back on and go, yeah, that was really beneficial to driving where the direction I took in my career. And we can start with whoever wants to start.
So, something comes to mind. So I actually did an internship at Abbott in 1994. So I'm dating myself. I was I believe a sophomore in college, and it was in the quality assurance part of Abbott, and it was the worst job I've ever had without anything close. And in high school, I worked at a pizza place and I did all that stuff. And it's a little different, obviously, because you're working for money, for money for your car or something. But it was one of the more eye-opening experiences I ever had, because you realize that there's a lot of roles that are just very, very challenging for people with kind of a scientific mind, because they're important, but they're very, very repetitive. And at the time, I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do after college, but that absolutely convinced me to go to graduate school, because as an undergrad, it's you don't realize sort of the power you have in terms of talking to a lot of grown-ups, as my kids would call them. You can basically walk around to any person and just knock on their door and they'll welcome you in, because we love having college kids around. It's really fun. It's refreshing. You kind of see the sort of wonder and the willingness to learn. And by doing that, I just walked around and talked to all these different people that did different things. And that's actually how I sort of learned about, say, process chemistry and medicinal chemistry. I didn't even know what it was until that point, but I sort of just got lucky and knocked on somebody's door and they explained it to me. And so, part of that, again, was really just trying to understand what people do in different areas. But I think the more you can get out there as an undergrad, if anything, I wish I would have done that a little bit more. I did academic research pretty much every summer, and I don't regret that at all. It was great. I worked for a great professor. But I think those early sort of exposures to just different worlds, like a big company or a small company or whatever it is, that is just really, really valuable.
Yeah, I'm mostly focused. I'm mostly focused on undergraduate research as well. When I was at Stanford, and I still love to recruit people that got very good training at academic institutions. I will say, as I mentioned earlier, that the reason I probably do what I do today is because my wife was a medicinal chemist, as I mentioned earlier, and she did 3 internships at Glaxo. So I think that really motivated her to continue with medicinal chemistry. So I see, fundamental value in any kind of lab-based training that you can identify. I will say another really important internship that I did was with the Mendocino County Air Quality Control District in the early 90s. And that was valuable for a different reason. It was because it was the first job that I ever really had where I was constantly looking at the clock. And that made me vow to identify a career where I would never look at the clock. And that has turned out to be the case, only when I'm late. So.
Yeah, that's your sign if you're looking at the clock that maybe it's not the right.
That's right. But I think like going back to the point of identifying all the different roles and seeing, what appeals to you as an individual. Is it a role where you are able to find more focus and really focus on on a particular subject, or do you like to interact more with people from other disciplines? Those are probably the kinds of experiences that you can start to get, as Andy mentioned, in more of an industrial setting.
Thank you. And
I
then,
don't know if I have too much more to add. If I can be a shill for a minute, the Genentech internship program is currently recruiting for summer interns. This year, I think there's a few weeks left. Check the Genentech careers website and you can sort by student or intern positions. There's only a couple weeks left. There may be some positions that are still open. It is for 3 months this summer. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, these will be remote internships, so probably focusing more on computational type work. But in the future, usually we do host several hundred in-person interns on site at Genentech. But anyway, the real answer is similar to Andy and Zach. I actually never did an internship either. Probably I was even in worse shape because as an undergrad, I had literally no idea what I wanted to do. So I ended up going to school and just really taking classes that I thought were interesting. So I ended up majoring in chemistry, but also philosophy and classics, and just was like, okay, what am I going to do with my life? And the fact that all of you are here, that you have an idea of the particular direction that you want to take your life, is already a step up beyond what I have. And so getting information or seeking out this type of information is really important. If you can get an internship, that's great. If not, get some work experience working in the lab, like I guess Andy, Zach, and I have done. Just get that exposure to science, I think is really important. And would determine if that's really what you want to do or not.
Not always, but I think oftentimes people, when they're hiring undergraduate interns, are looking for a relatively specific skill set, or at least some basic familiarity with the lab. So don't be discouraged if you don't get an internship in the first time you try. And then, as Dennis just suggested, get more training, hopefully on campus or on any campus, really. And I'm sure you'll be successful in following years.
okay, so next question, just a quick, if you all want to kind of go through a little bit of your day-to-day, what your days look like, just so that the attendees here kind of get an idea of what you do on a daily basis. And we can start. Andrew, you want to start?
I was actually going to suggest Zach.
Oh, okay.
You can walk us through the life of a CEO. So why don't you take it away, Zach?
Sure. So where to start? So I think there are two, my job really orients in two directions. One is management of the board. So the board consists of, in all companies really, or definitely in biotechnology, small biotechnology companies, of people that have invested money in the research that the company is doing. So I spend maybe 15% of my time talking with board members, preparing for those meetings, and telling them about the strategies that we're pursuing with our research, and maybe giving them brief research updates. The other part of my job orients towards just, management of the strategies and organization of the company. And I work with a team of experienced scientists here, talking about the research projects that they're working on. But importantly, I think I also spend a lot of time thinking about the goals of the company and how we should organize teams to address those goals, what the what our values should be, kind of ways of operating maybe, and those actually turn out surprisingly to be conscious decisions that need to be made. So that's probably another 50% of my time, and the remainder of my time is actually spent in one-on-one meetings with scientists or reading about science, and communicating with my team about exciting breakthrough areas of science that I think are relevant to the work that we're doing here.
Thank you. Andrew, now do you want to, would you like to?
Yeah, no, certainly. It's so There are a lot of similarities. So in the sense of, I spent a lot of time on kind of one-on-one or let's say small group meetings with mostly biologists and chemists as part of the day. So again, the way we're sort of organized is I work in cancer research, and there's three major areas within cancer research. The one that I run is really focused on a very specific area of biology. But as you imagine, there's a lot of different programs within that area. So each biologist is working on some component of these. So I spent a lot of time, like Zach said, reading about the different areas, and then also just meeting with the scientists to see how research is going and things like that. Another huge part for me is to spend a lot of time with our clinicians and what are called our precision medicine scientists. So when we start, let's say, a clinical trial, and I'll give one example. Around 2012, we took what was then a new mechanism, a drug for a new mechanism to the clinic, and we were actually working with Dennis's company Genentech on this for over a decade. In fact, we still do. But we thought that we understood a way to actually selectively kill cancer cells by targeting a single protein that these specific leukemia cells relied on. So we were very, very excited about that. We did know that there were going to be some patients that just may not respond. And so what we did very, very early on, which is typical, is basically lay out plans to take, let's say, blood samples from these patients over time. So it was very typical for us to take a number of blood samples, let's say the first day after the first dose, and then maybe once every week, and then once every month, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're basically looking at is the impact of the drug on various disease parameters and basically just factors of health as well. And then really try to understand by looking at data across a number of patients, what the patterns are. So if there's a number of patients that respond very well, we try to find commonalities. So there's a lot of time spent on that, because you can really go down a lot of rabbit holes, some of which are very interesting. But for example, with say whole genome sequencing, you can just generate massive amounts of data. But in order to do anything with it, you have to have a data scientist and a bioinformatician and a number of other people to help you kind of crunch this data and try to figure out what you're looking at. So it gets back to, again, this sort of multi-dimensional element of drug discovery, where a lot of the day is spent kind of running around and talking to different groups about data and what it means and what the next steps are. There's a smaller element but one that is kind of fairly interesting that I never imagined before. But we actually wind up doing a lot of interactions with some folks in very different parts of the organization, like the regulatory affairs and the global medical affairs. And I realize these terms probably don't mean anything. They certainly didn't to me for many, many years. But one story I think that might kind of resonate with people. So now I do kind of a few times a year, I'll go do these sales training meetings. So basically you're teaching your pharmaceutical salespeople about biological mechanisms for a drug they might be selling. I don't spend that much time doing that, but what's fascinating about it is I was, the first time I did it, I was picturing a bunch of like frat boys or something, or, I just had no idea what a salesperson looks like or does, or it's just sort of the antithesis of what you think about, right, when you're in graduate school. It turns out that these are some of the most intense people who study every single piece of literature they can get their hands on, because any insight they can bring to the table with a doctor might be the difference between actually making headway with that doctor prescribing a medicine or not. And believe it or not, that's even true in cancer, because there's a lot of different drug options. So there's enough of these kind of interactions like that where you wind up just spending time with folks from backgrounds that you don't normally think about. But again, it's all to come together around a common objective. In this case, is to learn which patients we should try to treat with a certain drug. And then once we figure that out, how to get it out into the wild, so to speak, and make sure that we can get it to the right patients and make sure that doctors are prescribing it. Because that's another challenge that, again, you don't necessarily think about, but it can be very, very difficult once you get outside of, let's say, academic centers like UCSF. You go up to, let's say, Eureka or a small town. You may have an oncologist that treats 50 different cancers, so they're not an expert in your area. You have to come up with ways to communicate with them. So there's a lot of different types of of communications like that, again, with different teammates who do very, very different things.
Thank you. And Dennis.
So I guess my day job, right? So what do I do? Probably less exciting, it feels like. I was gonna say too many meetings. Wait, especially with the pandemic, everything is now a meeting or a Zoom meeting. So we're trying to get used to this now. But yeah, more realistically, I guess I started my career as, I guess, what we call an individual contributor, so a lab scientist. But now I do lead a group of scientists here at Genentech, and like I said, our functional area is around formulation and drug delivery, and so finding strategies for delivering drugs to where they need to go in the body. And so there are challenges to this that we work on every day. Probably the most fun are the scientific challenges, so getting us together, encountering a problem on a particular project team, and seeing how we can resolve it or figure out a solution, a new way of getting the drug there, for example. And that's really the most fun part, is thinking scientifically and applying that in working together and in brainstorming. I guess the other aspect as this is not only kind of the scientific or the specific scientific aspects, but also looking at how we do the science. And so the processes and the workflows, and are we doing things as efficiently as we can? So a lot of efficiency analysis, that type of thing, project management, resource allocation. Probably not, I'm not quite a CEO. I don't have my hands on the money or anything like that. But we do have to look at how we distribute resources around the group to be efficient in solving these issues. And, you know, different companies will focus on different disease areas because one company can't do everything. And so we have to learn how to prioritize and really play to our strengths to that extent. I would say the other aspect of being a group lead is that it's almost like a PI or a professor type role. And so beyond the technical aspects, I'm also really involved in people's career development. And so trying to give them, even people within the group, advice on their development areas, technical skills they should learn, social skills, helping them network, those types of aspects. And that is actually pretty fulfilling for me. It does make me proud when I see people in the group be successful, really support a project team, have that big win, you know, getting a project to the next milestone or getting to that next promotion or getting their paper out. That is really pretty gratifying to that extent.
Thank you. Thank you all for answering my questions. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to everyone else to ask questions. I haven't seen any come through, but we do have about 10 minutes. But before we do that, I'm going to launch a poll real quick. And then if attendees can go ahead and answer there's 3 questions. They're very simple, multiple choice. And then while our attendees are doing that, I would love to go through and ask Dennis, Andrew, and Zachary what your favorite memory of being at Cal was while the poll is going on. So we can just go ahead and start. Dennis, if you want to just continue.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. This is a hard question. Favorite memory.
Maybe your favorite place to eat.
Oh, well, there's too many. I think Cheese Board is still there, right? And Zachary's. Yeah, we used to have group meetings late at night. Maybe they still do. So we always used to go out as a group to get dinner and then come back for group meeting. But I would say probably the favorite memory. So I rented an apartment in South Berkeley by Ashby BART station, which turns out to be not particularly the nicest place to live, but we ended up splitting a house with 3 other students in the chemistry department. So it was like basically the chemistry frat house. It was what it ended up being. And so we would host all sorts of social occasions at the house with most of the chemistry department there. And it was just I do think grad school, and I think most of this audience are undergrads. And I think that's fine. I think as you consider your future career, whether you want to look at industry, you know, get started with that, or if you are considering grad school, there is this aspect of grad school which I found, you know, you're all in it together, and so you're all going through this experience, and it is a tough experience, but I think it really brought a lot of us together, and so we've made, you know, still keep in contact with many friends from back then, and so that cumulatively would be my favorite memory.
Great. Thank you. Andrew, any memory you want to share with us?
Yeah. So like Dennis, there's a lot, but it's. I still remember how it was just amazing to see Telegraph Avenue coming from, kind of a sleepy East Bay town. And then I grew up going to Cal games and stuff like that. So I've obviously, have a lifelong bias. Now, like Zach, my dad went to Stanford undergrad and Cal grad. Unlike Zach, my dad made the right choice to become mostly a Cal fan. So he roots for Cal against Stanford. That's another story. But so I remember just the fact that growing up as a Cal fan and my dad, who's also a scientist, just hearing all the stories and the history of different departments. The first few weeks of being there as a grad student was I still remember it was sort of chilling for me. And I remember when I was in high school, and I just saw somebody talk about Top Dog, which by the way is spectacular. But I think the atmosphere at Berkeley is just, I still think it's magic. I, like a lot of us, I've done a lot of recruiting at different places. I think there's something about Berkeley that's just very, very hard to replicate. And I think just the sort of the diversity, the intensity, but also just the kind of passion. So when I remember the first day I was teaching undergraduate organic chemistry, just looking out at the undergraduates, and I just was absolutely blown away. So yeah, I still think about that. I mean, it was, I taught 3 semesters, I think it was, and I loved the teaching there. I've never taught in an organized fashion sense, but I loved every day of teaching because I just thought the students were just absolutely amazing.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I realize we're running out of time, so I'll just, comment briefly, but I think any time that we could spend together with people in the department was really special. Going out to lunch, going out having drinks after work, but everybody was working really hard. There were so many incredible people that you could meet that it felt like, again, anytime that you had the opportunity to socialize with people in the department and get to know them on another level was really great. And I think that's one of the reasons that all of us love going back to Berkeley so much, is you kind of capture a little bit of that feeling of walking out of lab with these people that you're getting to know really well at a really important time in your life. And just in closing, want to echo, I tell people all the time, independent of where I, matriculated from or graduated from, that, the students at Berkeley are really, really, really special, especially the ones that are focused on studies, which is most of the population. And I always tell people that the most incredible undergraduates that I ever encountered were definitely from Berkeley. So I would encourage you to, all make the most of the amazing opportunity that you have.
I certainly agree with you. I've been here for almost 5 months, and I agree with everything you said. This has been a great experience, and the students here are phenomenal. We do have a quick question, or a question from Jennifer. Jennifer, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. Nice to meet everybody. I'm not exactly a STEM major, but I was drawn here because I understand that everybody is working within the pharmaceutical industry. In my family, that's personally helped a lot of people live a lot better through chemistry. There's been some disease and illness that I would like to be a part of an industry that helps contribute to the betterment of people's lives. And you had mentioned it takes a team to get these pieces moving. And could anyone potentially direct me into a sales position? Or if somebody doesn't exactly have a background in the sciences, what would we do to still participate in this industry?
So one item that comes to mind, and Dennis had mentioned this too. So we have internships as well. I obviously tend to take more folks from the technical side just in our area, but a lot of big companies, Genentech, AbbVie, others have very large internship programs, and actually most of the internships by number are non-technical. So it's great to hear that, Jennifer. I think you would be surprised how many different roles you can sort of look at, especially as Zach said, coming from a school like Berkeley. You will get opportunities. I think it's, perhaps Dennis, maybe you can jump in here, but again, I would be looking at some of those the kind of internship programs at large companies, just because they tend to take a lot of students.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce, and I alluded to this very briefly, Jennifer, when I gave my answer, but a lot of the work that I actually do revolves around trying to decide how to organize ourselves to make decisions, human resources, organizational psychology. And so there are aspects of the organizations as well that you might be interested in that touch on those subjects: project management positions, human resources positions. I also think, as Andy mentioned, and Dennis mentioned as well, there are large commercial aspects of these organizations that really do contribute to health. They're delivering medicines fundamentally to patients that need them. So, I'm sure any of us would be happy to communicate with you more offline, but there are lots and lots of roles. And I've worked with many people in my past that had a non-technical background that were making really important contributions to large and small companies.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
great.
Yeah. Many options. And I think, as Andy mentioned, many internship possibilities. So, keep an eye out for that.
Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. I wanted to thank Dennis, Andrew, Zachary for your time tonight. Very informative. Thank you for sharing your experience, your background, and your path. I know I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot, and I'm sure the attendees did as well. So thank you again, and we're going to go ahead and end everything, and hopefully we'll do something like this again soon.
Great, thank you guys, and nice to see you again, Dennis and Andy.
Yep.
Talk to you soon.
Bye,
Yeah,
everybody.
thanks a lot.
Yep.
Right.